Rishi Sunak now, he is considering a plan to help first-time buyers. It essentially would enable much broader access to a 99% loan-to-value, basically, mortgage. So, therefore, you'd need just 1% deposit. So this is basically a big expansion of the mortgage guarantee scheme, in essence. Do you think this is a solution to the housing woes that many people find themselves in, Peter?
I wouldn't have thought so. It means they'll be saddled from the very start with an enormous debt, far bigger than they'll probably be able to cope with. Many of us have been through the mortgage jungle and have, in my case, come close to going underwater because it just becomes incredibly expensive, particularly when interest rates get high. I don't think the idea of having a home-owning democracy has been a success. I think a lot of people don't really see it as realistic now that they can expect to own a home. If the government really wanted to take the issue of housing seriously, then it would reconsider the grave mistake made by Margaret Thatcher and Michael Heseltine in the 1980s of getting rid of council housing, because it was an extremely useful way in which people could, particularly young families, find places to live, houses with gardens in proper communities, which they could afford and which they could move to and from if they wanted to move jobs. All that's gone. And we have instead either buy your own house at an immense expense in spending huge amounts of money paying interest on a debt that never seems to go away, or being stuck in the absolute scandal of housing benefit, which costs more than the Royal Air Force and seems to me to be the most inefficient and unpleasant way of delivering housing support that anyone's ever thought of.
Alan?
Well, I think it's somewhat low horizons and low in ambition to assume that everyone in Britain can't own their own home. I think that that's definitely something that's achievable in a modern society. However, to do that, we need to have a house building campaign. At least 5 million houses. Very simple supply and demand demonstrates that, you know, you'd have jobs for people in Britain, you'd have affordability because the price would go down, it would be available. Now, that is going to ruffle some feathers with some people who have been led to believe that their wealth is tied up with owning their house, unfortunately. But in order for young people to be able to afford having houses and to be able to have a proper, robust investment and an industry and an employment, that's what we need to have happen. Unfortunately, no one's tackling that. We've got short-termism again. There's an election year. And what we need is medium and long-term planning alongside the rest of innovation. That's what we need for house building. So this is an attempt to fix an issue that really needs to be addressed in a different way.
That's just the housing developer's anthem. You build huge numbers of houses, it won't make any difference to the price of houses because of at least two enormous pressures on housing prices, which you haven't mentioned. One is the continuing mass immigration, which comes constantly into this country. The other is the breakdown of the married family, which means huge numbers of families which used to occupy one house now occupy two. And so the result of that is that houses have become under such heavy demand, you could concrete over the country, it wouldn't bring the price down by £1. It's a fantasy. This is constantly being said. If we build more houses, the price will go down. It isn't true. If you want to provide houses which are affordable to people, then some sort of subsidised public housing is the way to do it. And I think the time has come to recognise we made a mistake when we got rid of it.
It's interesting you say it's a fantasy, and then you say you might as well concrete it all, and then it wouldn't be possible. The price wouldn't go down at all. And then
you could
I
build
suppose
more
the supposition,
the price would go down.
Sorry, Peter,
let him finish. Go on.
But the supposition is that that somehow that the state would just be able to provide it, and the money will come from somewhere, subsidised somehow. Someone's got to pay for it. And the point, I think, is that you can have some subsidy and you can have a safety net. But the idea that you have blanket provision en masse to solve this issue is not the solution. And I think it lacks ambition and it has low horizons.
Well, one of the happiest and most prosperous times in this country was when the great house building programme of the Macmillan government succeeded. A lot of that was council housing. A lot of those houses were very much valued by the people who lived in them. Those estates were civilised and law-abiding and pleasant to live on, and they've been broken up. And replaced by what? By the standards to which those houses were built were pretty high by comparison with the little box homes which people are asked to live in now, and for which they have to get into colossal amounts of debt. Yeah. Telling people they have to borrow less Certain people they have to put on a smaller deposit, but borrow more isn't actually really helping them. It's just postponing the day when they'll get the mortgage off their backs. These mortgages hang around people's necks all their lives, and in some cases, with the mortgages being offered by banks these days, they can't conceivably hope to pay them off. This is no way for people to live. And
one thing
it also gets people into the very bad habit of indebtedness, which certainly my generation was brought up, in my view, rightly to dread.
Well, the one thing you didn't mention was it was 2 decades of economic development and growth, which is what underwrote a lot of that. And, of course, we had the World War and all the intervention that had to have as a consequence because of that. So we had 2 decades of growth. We've had very, very sluggish growth since then in Britain, and we have to be more ambitious. We have to have innovation. There should be safety provision, but there needs to be a comprehensive house building campaign. And the issue of the borders or migration or whatever should be handled in that context. Each of these things need to be addressed robustly.
Let me just ask you, when you're saying about, we shouldn't have got rid of these council houses and all the rest of it, so you're referring to the thing like right to buy. So
yes.
Are you against the concept of right to buy?
Completely.
Or is it the fact that they didn't replenish the stock?
Well, they weren't allowed to replenish the stock, because immediately any council house becomes available to be sold, it can be sold. And they weren't allowed to spend, I think, the receipts on housing either. But I think the actual selling off was part of the mistake. These housing estates were working, settled communities of a kind which were extremely valuable, and they were broken up and destroyed by the sale of council houses. If people want to buy houses, sure. I've bought a house over a very long period of time, and I'm glad ultimately that I did it, but it was a huge stretch, and I'm not by any means one of the worst paid people in this country. And I sympathise greatly with people who are not as well paid as I am, who want to have a decent-sized house in which to raise a family with children, with a garden in which they can play, in which you can have a healthy, settled life. And this is not readily available to an awful lot of people. And the standards of the houses now being built, when I see them, seem to me to be dismal compared with what people used to live in back in the 50s and 60s.
Well, do you know, go on.
Well, I think it could be said about the standards, but I think it's really problematic, the notion that ordinary people, working class people, the aspiration should be to have the state provide them with a home. It was only ever meant to be a safety net. Now, you can look at all sorts of places around the world where there are big house building campaigns going on. I mean, as it happens, Nashville and Tennessee, you see a lot of people moving in different states where there's actual expansion, and they are low in price, and sometimes they increase as a consequence of it. But the thing is, to say it's the mantra of the house building associations, it seems to be preposterous. There's an oligopoly here in this country that have enormous lobbying pressure on the government, and there's a kind of there's a problem, there's a bottleneck with the fact that they're actually preventing local builders and many others from being able to develop in the way that it should be done. And I think that really we need scale. That means tackling the thorny question of the green belt and other areas as well. But we know that a huge percentage, I think it's 85% of the UK is not developed as it happens. And we have lots of area where we can do it. It would also provide lots of employment. And we need to tackle it, not to try and put a plaster over it by saying we're just going to reduce the deposit amount and get into the same situation we saw in 2008.
And do you remember, like, when we talk about council housing, a story caught my eye of the last few days, actually, where you've got a Labour MP, so the MP's salary is about £86,000 or thereabouts, living in a council flat. You used to have that union boss that very proudly declared that he lived in a council house. So when it comes to who should be eligible for said council properties, I mean, surely not people that are getting 80-odd grand a year.
I would have thought not, no, and I'm sure that someone in that position shouldn't do that. But it still doesn't tackle the issue of what people who are on far, far less than that, but who are working hard to get any income at all, should have to pay for a house in which you can raise a family. This is the crucial thing that people want. They want a house in which they can raise a family, particularly a house with a garden in a safe and settled, crime-free area, and that's what they can't, by and large, get. And the people are compelled to live in much smaller houses and even flats, which are not really fit for family. And the lives that people are leading are much more confined than they should be. And I think that a revival of something, we don't have to call it the same thing for, like a revival of something resembling the council house building programme of the 1950s would be a better way of doing it than in trying to encourage people to take on mortgages they can't really afford.
Let me throw that open to you. Who do you agree with? And what about this whole premise of a council house, then, so to speak? Who should be eligible for one of those? Because surely in this day and age, when you've got an MP on nearly 90 grand a year living in a council flat, what? That doesn't make any sense, does it? John says, I don't normally agree with Peter Hitchens, but he's absolutely right when it talks about building council houses. That is absolutely the right answer. Will says, high house prices have become a drag on the economy. There should be more competition to lower the price of houses. Den says, given the billions wasted by government on student loans, which will never be repaid, surely then they could fund a scheme which pays the deposit element for first-time buyers only, up to 10%. I like your thinking, it's radical, but is that the direction we should be going in? That we, the taxpayers, because the government has no money, they've only got our money, should we be paying the deposits for people to then have as assets in their homes? Do you like that idea? And let's remind ourselves as well, the house building target was 300,000. Of course, that hasn't been missed. I don't need to remind you all that net migration was multiple times that, so you couldn't even put all the new people coming into the country